Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Frank Feston, and thanks for being with us. Earlier this week, you heard us dive into the House's closest contest with Aaron Covey, who leads the Cook Political Report with Amy Walters' coverage of the House of Representatives. And today, I'm joined by Cook's Senate and Governor's editor, Jessica Taylor, to talk about the Senate and the handful of toss-up elections that'll decide control of the upper chamber of Congress. Jessica, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with an overview, if you don't mind. What's the current balance of power looking like in the Senate?
So Democrats have a 51-49 majority, so it's about as close as you can get. And, they overperformed in 2022, a cycle when typically we would see the president's party lose seats. Democrats were very much buoyed by the Dobbs decision that energized women and helped them in many key races, and underperforming Republican candidates, weak Republican nominees in Pennsylvania, in Georgia, and Arizona. And so they actually flipped a seat into their column. And that one seat is actually going to make a lot of difference this cycle because Democrats have a very difficult Senate map. They're defending 23 seats to just 11 for Republicans. They're essentially entirely on defense. And a lot of those seats are in either very red territory, like West Virginia, Montana, or Ohio, or in presidential battlegrounds like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, and Nevada. Republicans have a few seats that are more vulnerable, like Texas, potentially Florida. But overwhelmingly, this is Democrats having to protect a very fragile majority.
Before we get into any of the specifics here, what generally makes Cook move a race in one direction or another? And is it typical to see a lot of movement here this close to the election? We only have 3 weeks to go.
So we look at things from both a qualitative and a quantitative standpoint. We certainly look at public polling, but we're talking with sources. We're talking with campaigns. We're talking with super PACs. So we see a lot of private data that isn't out there. And so, we're looking at a lot of numbers, a lot of the direction of the numbers, where the undecided voters are. So it's a lot of different things that we take it into account. And, we have 3 weeks. I'm not guaranteeing that these ratings all remain the same. They could still move in the final little bit still.
Yeah, I don't expect you, me, or anybody covering this to get a lot of sleep these next few weeks. So going to be monitoring all this changes very closely. My caffeine intake is dangerous these days. I was going to say, so things this close, as we've already said, really does mean just a few of these contests are going to decide whether the Republicans or the Democrats control the upper chamber. And I'm curious, there's one that I wanted to call out right at the top. I've been hearing it a ton over these last few weeks, that the seat held by Joe Manchin, the current independent and recent Democrat, who is choosing to retire, meaning that the seat is open, matters so much in the grand scheme of things. Can you explain why for our listeners?
We talked about Democrats having that 51-49 advantage. Joe Manchin started off as the most vulnerable incumbent. I think that if he had run for re-election, he would have been a severe underdog. He's not. And there's no one that Democrats really could have run in his place that would have made this race competitive. So Democrats have essentially ceded that seat. We rate that open seat race as solid Republican, as sure a Republican pickup as you can get. The governor there, Jim Justice, is going to be the next senator, best known for his bulldog that he takes everywhere, his English bulldog, Baby Dog. So really maybe Baby Dog's the actual senator. So that means that Democrats start out at 50-50 then. If you factor in that West Virginia loss, which means that they cannot lose any more incumbents. They have to defend every single one. And they also need Kamala Harris to win the presidency so that even if it were tied 50-50, that a Vice President Tim Walz would be the tie-breaking vote, which is what we saw happen after the 2020 election.
I've seen a lot of reporting these last few weeks saying that the race for Democrat Jon Tester's seat in Montana could be both the most critical and potentially decisive race in all of the Senate. Can you bring us into that contest and why it's seen as such a vital contest for the Democrats?
Well, if West Virginia is a seat that Trump won by almost 40 points, Montana is still very difficult. It's a state that Trump won in 2020 by 16 points. Now, Jon Tester has represented this state since 2006. He ousted a Republican incumbent then. He won re-election subsequently twice, but he is in the fight for his life. There's a couple of things that have changed since 2006. This class of senators, Jon Tester included, and then Sher Brown in Ohio, that I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute, they run in very favorable Democratic years. 2006 was Democratic midterm, where Democrats took back the House and the Senate, backlash to Bush and the Iraq War. They were reelected in 2012 as Obama rolled to reelection. And then they were elected again in 2018, which was the blue wave, Trump's first midterm election. Now they are running in a presidential year when we simply see more polarization than we do in midterm years. In 2016, every single Senate race went the same way as the presidential race in the state, in every state. In 2020, only Susan Collins of Maine managed to win re-election, even as Joe Biden carried her state. She outran Trump by 7 points. Jon Tester needs to outrun Harris by double digits. The polling we have seen has consistently had him down to his Republican challenger, Tim Sheehy. He's a Purple Heart recipient, a former Navy SEAL. He moved to Montana about a decade ago to open an aerial firefighting company. And, Tester has this sort of everyman Montana about him. He's a dirt farmer. He lost 3 fingers in a meat grinding accident. And he's sort of been able to, his other opponents, paint them as insufficiently Montana. But Montana is changing. When Jon Tester was first elected, more than half of the state, people were native Montanans. This is a very parochial state. That's now down to about a third. We've seen a lot of people moving in, more conservative people moving in from California, from Oregon, from Washington, moving away from blue states to kind of seeking, bigger lands and different things. Tester has tried to sort of embody Sheehy as this type of Montanan that moves in rich, buys up all the land, drives up home prices, and is insufficiently Montanan. But Sheehy has put his own money in the race. He's been able to drive up Tester's negatives to where they're underwater, which they've never been before. So in our ratings, we have this race rated lean Republican, which means that at this point, Jon Tester is the underdog. And that could be the whole ballgame there. If they flip that race, then Republicans are virtually guaranteed a majority unless Democrats can find another Republican-held seat to flip.
There's 3 true toss-ups in Cook's most recent ratings that I wanted to talk about for just a moment on a similar theme. You just mentioned Democrat Sher Brown's seat in Ohio, but also the open seat in Michigan and Democrat Tammy Baldwin's seat in Wisconsin. Again, these are the 3 true toss-ups that you'll have at this moment in time. Democrats are on defense in all 3 of these contests, and they've all been held by Democrats for at least 10 years. That seat in Michigan has been held since 2001 by the retiring senator there. So longtime Democratic control in all of these places. What's making them so competitive in this election cycle?
Ohio, much like Montana, has just trended more in Republicans' direction. Trump won this state in both 2016 and in 2020 by 8 points. Ohio used to be the quintessential swing state that picked presidents, and it's no longer a swing state at the presidential level. Sher Brown, also like Jon Tester, has had sort of weaker opponents and been able to run in good years. But I think unlike Tester, Brown has to only outrun Harris by 8 points, maybe less. We've seen some polling. If it gets much higher than that, that's where it becomes dicier. While I think Sheehy against Tester has run a very good race, Brown benefits from the fact that his opponent, Bernie Moreno, who's a luxury car dealer, a Colombian immigrant, has not run a very good race. He's sort of ceded the airwaves to Brown over the summer. He's really struggled to consolidate Republican Trump voters behind him. Now, if Trump voters continue to move toward Moreno, then there's a very good chance that Brown could lose. And this race is right within the margin of error. But Brown is in a better position, I think, just because the lean of the state is slightly better for him and because he has a weaker opponent than Tester is.
And then what about the races in Wisconsin and Michigan? Can you speak to those a little bit?
I mean, these are presidential swing states that are just always very tight. As Dan Rather might say, tight as a tick. And while we saw Democrats there having a lead for much of the summer, we've seen those numbers tighten. So, our most recent move was in Wisconsin, where Tammy Baldwin, first elected in 2012, was running ahead of Harris much of the summer. She had a Republican opponent in Eric Hovde. He's a wealthy banker, has been hit for living in California, and a lot of controversial things he said about suggesting people in nursing homes shouldn't vote or are unable to vote, that the people who are overweight should pay more for health care. I think that Hovde was able to sort of benefit from the tightening presidential race there. And so we've really seen this race tighten to where both parties have it just within a couple of points. Baldwin was slightly leading, but again, all within the margin of error. Michigan is an open seat race with Debbie Stabenow retiring there. So I think, you have the Democratic nominee is Alyssa Slotkin, who's represented a swing district there in the Lansing area. She's a former CIA operative, CIA analyst. She's running against former Congressman Mike Rogers, who's a former FBI agent. Now, he was in Congress back in 2000 to 2014. He retired. He's coming back to a very different Republican Party, and that's sort of been a struggle for him. He definitely was not a Trump-style Republican, even though he now has endorsed the former president. Slotkin is not as well known as, it doesn't enjoy sort of the same incumbency advantage and being known statewide that, for instance, Baldwin does. So I think we see a slightly tighter race because of that. Slotkin has the most money going into the final stretch, though we are seeing super PACs pouring a lot of money in there. I might slightly rather be Slotkin in this instance, but you have Rogers that has really hit her on EV mandates, for instance. Slotkin has really been in defense of those in some of the recent debates and in her ads saying, I am not going to mandate what you drive. I don't drive AEV, but, I want them to be made in Michigan and not in China and stuff. So energy, the car industry also playing a big factor in this race.
Let's stick with the Democrats for a moment, looking at Senate races in Arizona, Nevada, and Pennsylvania that are all leaning towards the Democrats at this moment in time. Major swing states in this presidential election. I think that it's really interesting that at the same time as Dems are looking to gain ground or are gaining ground in the Senate races in these states, we've seen a good bit of polling in the last few days indicating that former President Donald Trump is gaining ground there in the presidential contest. So what's giving Democratic candidates an edge in these states that Vice President Harris might not have at this current moment in time? And are you expecting, if the current situation holds, to see some split ticket voting in these states?
I think that Arizona and Nevada are kind of a little bit in a different category. And I think that's where we see that candidate quality matters. We saw this again, I mentioned in 2022 matter. I think overall Republicans got a lot better candidates, but Arizona, for instance, stands out as a glaring weakness. Republican Carrie Lake, she very narrowly lost the governor's race there, became a very polarizing figure. She's an election denier. She challenged her gubernatorial result, still has never conceded and still continued to challenge it in court. Congressman Ruben Gallego there was going to primary Kyrsten Sinema there, much more moderate. She ended up leaving the party, becoming an independent, decided not to run as an independent. And Gallego's more progressive, for instance, than Mark Kelly, who managed to win this seat twice in the past 2 cycles. But Gallego had more money to define himself. He's a Marine Corps veteran, talked about how he grew up with poverty, with a single mother. And, so he was able to introduce himself while Lake brought a lot of negatives to this race. Gallego has been able to win over, I think, lower propensity voters, more Latino voters, more male Latino voters in particular. So I think we could see split ticketing here in Arizona because actually at the presidential level, it looks like Arizona, the swing states, is probably Trump's best performing state. Republicans hope that if Trump is able to open up more of a lead there, that he could pull Lake over the top. But right now, Gallego has the advantage here. And in Nevada, Jackie Rosen, first-term senator, and Nevada is a very transient state. The electorate turns over about every 4 years. Almost half of the electorate does. So Rosen wasn't as well known, but she used her financial advantage to really sort of define herself and define her opponent, former Army Captain Sher Brown, who stepped on an IED while serving overseas, was very badly burned, another Purple Heart recipient, Bronze Star recipient. He just wasn't able to raise the money to combat that, and she really hammered him, particularly on abortion. Now, there's 2 abortion referendums on the ballot in Arizona and in Nevada. So we see those Democrats actually being able to go after women voters in particular. And what we've seen in polling as well is that voters are more likely to blame Senate candidates on abortion than they are President Trump. They just simply don't believe that he would endorse a national abortion ban. But when it comes to Senate candidates, I think that's another thing making a difference, as well as candidate quality. And then the other race that we have in our lean column for now is Pennsylvania. And I think it is a little bit different than Arizona and Nevada. It is the quintessential swing state that we have this cycle, the biggest electoral prize with 19 electoral votes. Bob Casey, another long-term incumbent elected in 2006, also had weaker opponents. He's been able to say he can run ahead of Harris. The Casey name is political gold in this state. His father was governor, so he had sort of that known quantity about him. His Republican opponent, David McCormick, was hit for, he grew up in the Pittsburgh area, but then went to West Point, became a hedge fund executive. So they've really hit him for that, for ties for his business to China, for having a home in Connecticut, sort of painting him as insufficiently Pennsylvania. But as the presidential race is tightened, we've seen that race tighten as well. So it's more, even though it's in the same column for now, it is more competitive than Arizona and Nevada.
Let's bounce over to one of the marquee Senate races we're watching for the Republicans, the Senate seat in Texas held by Ted Cruz. Cook recently shifted that seat to leans Republican from likely Republican. So you recently changed your rating to indicate that the race was going to be more competitive. It's a state that Democrats have been after for several years now. What went into making that change? And could we actually see a blue senator from Texas overtake Ted Cruz?
Texas to me feels sort of like Democrats and Lucy in the football, that it seems so close, and yet at the end, you just can't pull it out. In Cruz's 2018 race, Beto O'Rourke raised a lot of money, had a lot of grassroots momentum, and just came short of by about 2 points. Colin Alred is running a bit of a different strategy. He's raising a lot of money. He's very heavy on air. Beto went to all of Texas's counties, had more of this sort of, on the ground approach. But there's two things that I think have changed in Texas: abortion and Cancun. So Cruz very much a hardliner on abortion. Texas is one of the most stringent abortion bans in the country. So Allred's very much running ads on that, with women that were denied care and had to go out of state and that their health was threatened. And then Cancun, there was a 2021 winter storm in Texas. The power grid failed. Cruz was on vacation in Mexico with his family. He was pilloried for this. He had to come back. There's sort of this iconic image of us rolling a suitcase through the airport with a Texas mask on. I watched a focus group of Trump voters who were undecided in this race. All of them independently brought up Cancun. Cruz, again, he is not well liked, even among Republicans. And I think that sort of crystallized many of the reasons they don't like him, but he still has an R beside of his name. And I think that's still why he still has an advantage. But the money in this race and those two outside factors has made it closer. I still think Allred is more than likely than not to come up a few points short. Those last few points in Texas are just Herculean. But as we talked about with Montana earlier, if Democrats lose Montana, they have to find another seat to put in play. And Texas right now is their best opportunity.
You just gave us a ton of information, Jessica, and I'm really appreciative of your time. What other contests are you closely watching? Are there any others we could see shift here in the final stretch?
The other seats where Republicans are on defense, Florida, we still have as likely Republican Rick Scott there being challenged by former Congresswoman Debbie Mukersel-Powell. Scott has a lot of money he's able to put into that race. He can write himself a check. He's a multimillionaire. I still think that's a much tougher. The surprise of the cycle has kind of been Nebraska. Nebraska actually has 2 seats up this cycle. One's a special election where Ben Sasse left the Senate and the former governor, Pete Ricketts, was appointed to that. You would think the special election would be the more competitive one, but Ricketts is fine. He's winning in a landslide. But the one that's more surprising is the regular election there with Deb Fischer. She's running for her 3rd term, but she's being challenged by an independent candidate named Dan Osborne. He's a union leader, helped lead a strike at a Kellogg cereal plant there in Omaha. He's saying he's not beholden to any party, but he also is, at the same time, he's being supported by a lot of Democratic interest groups that have poured a lot of money into this race, hitting Fisher for reneging on her 2 term limits pledge. But he's really sort of emphasizing his blue collar roots. A lot of his work ads show him, welding or in a factory and different things, and saying, that actually, the $176,000 the senators make would be a pay raise for him, which is not the case with most senators. So he's really sort of emphasizing, I can relate to you with your economic struggles. And I think that is breaking through. We're seeing some tightening poll numbers there. That's one I would watch. And again, Democrats kind of have to play it. You asked the chair of the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, which I have, Gary Peters, about this race. He says they're not interested, that Osborne isn't actually a Democrat. He said he wouldn't caucus with either party, which is hard to do. But Osborne is getting most of the support from Democrats. There is not a Democrat in the race, so he's benefiting from that. And so that is a closer race that we're certainly watching. And remember that, Nebraska, while the state overall is going to go red, because the state divides its electoral college votes, Nebraska's 2nd congressional district is a battleground, and an electoral vote that Harris is expected to pick up. It's home to one of the most competitive House races as well. So Nebraska actually pretty interesting.
Yeah, I used to live in Omaha, actually. It's a state that contains more multitudes than people would think.
Yeah.
So this depends so critically on who wins the presidency and who controls the House, of course. But walk us through some hypothetical scenarios, if you don't mind. What could control of the Senate mean for both parties?
Republicans, listen, if they have a very narrow majority, if it's only a 51-49 majority, you could see some of these more independent-minded senators like Lisa Murkowski of Alaska or Susan Collins of Maine, who's up for re-election in 2026, sort of wield more outsized control in the way that Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema have. Even if Trump wins, his agenda could be a little more hampered by that. But Republicans want to, run at the score as much as they can because the 2026 map is much harder. I mentioned Maine. They'll be defending a seat in North Carolina and Iowa, but then Democrats are also going to have to defend seats in Michigan and Georgia as well. So the 2026 map is harder in many ways. I think for Democrats, again, even getting to 50-50, holding that would be a victory, I think.
So much to watch, and we're going to be watching all of your race updates really closely these next weeks. Jessica Taylor of the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter. Thank you again so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And for our listeners, you can learn more about Cook's ratings and our Senate coverage at the links in our show notes. We'll be back next week with another episode. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Frank Festa, and thank you for listening. We'll see you next week.